Okay everyone, so today we're going to be looking at one of the 12 principles of animation and animating squash and stretch into a title animation to create this effect. Okay, so it's a fairly simple text animation, but adding the squash and stretch principle to it really just gives it that extra element of characteristics and animation. So we're going to get straight into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new composition. I'm just going to call this S2 for stretch 2, 1920 by 1080, 25 frames, and I've gone for 2 seconds with a background colour of black, which gives us our starting comp, as you can see here. So at this point I'm going to just create a new by right clicking, selecting new solid, and I'm going to call this background or BG and hit OK. I'm going to go to effects and presets and type in grad to bring up the gradient ramp and drag this onto our background layer, and I'm going to make this a nice blue, light blue to dark blue gradient ramp, as can be seen here. Right, at this point I'm going to right click and go to new and text, and I'm going to type in squash and duplicate squash, double click it and type in stretch and turn off caps lock. And I'm just going to center these two by going to align, center, center, and squash, center, and center. Now with stretch I'm going to drop this underneath squash because it's slightly longer text, and I'm going to bring this to around about here. So it looks like it's sat on a floor. Now at this point what I like to do is get the finished sort of the framing looking finished, and what I mean by that is getting the alignment all in its finished state. Now before I move on I'm just going to hit V to bring back the selection tool, which is this tool here. If you keep it in the text tool and you click by accident, you will create another text layer, which we want to avoid. So I'm going to get squash and hit P on the keyboard, and I'm just going to position squash to around about there, which is how I want it to look at its finished state. And I'm going to move my cursor over to 20 frames and hit the stopwatch to tell After Effects at this moment this is where I want the animation to end. I'm also going to hit S for scale and hit the stopwatch for that as well. Now at this point, if you hit U on the keyboard, it will bring up the animation keyframes of the layer which you've added these keyframes to. So in this case it's squash. Now just for my own sake I'm going to move this layer under this layer so it looks similar to it does on the screen here. So squash is now on top. Now I can go back to the beginning of my timeline and move my position to above the frame so it looks like it's starting off screen, like so. And I'm going to move my cursor just so I can see squash appear on screen, like here, about here. And now I'm going to create a stretch effect, and to do that I'm going to use the scale, and I'm going to press this button here to unlink these two parameters, and I'm going to increase this parameter to create a sort of stretch effect on the text. And at this point I'm now going to move this cursor back to this keyframe back to here. So now the stretch is occurring all the way up until this point, and it goes back to its regular scale by the 20 frames keyframe. The reason for that is because we told it to. However, we want it to stay consistently stretched, so I'm going to duplicate this keyframe by pressing Command C and Command V, and what that will do, or Control C and Control V, what it will do is it will copy this keyframe and paste it here as well, so we now have a consistent stretch. Now if this is where we want our animation to end, and I'm just going to move these two keyframes a little bit further up to 2 seconds, So now what we want to happen is between this frame and this frame, we want to see the bounce effect happening. So what I'm going to do at this point is move squash down to about here, and I'm going to grab my position and move it down to just underneath where stretch occurs. So just about there. So now you'll notice we have an animation keyframe for position here. So what we're going to have, or see at this point, is a bit of a faster drop. So now we've got this position, we want to create the bounce, so I'd like it to go further up by about here. So grabbing the position, I'm going to move it up slightly and down slightly. And then it will correct itself by about here. So let's watch this through. Okay, now if we want to even out this bounce a little bit, I'm just going to move this keyframe. So these 4 keyframes now are even. Okay, so now we've got a bit of an issue with the squash, with the stretch rather. So we've got the squash, we now need to refine it. So the effect is at its lowest point here. So we're going to move this keyframe a little bit closer, maybe about here. And now we're going to squash our squash text. So I'm going to do this. And then as it bounces, we want it to have a bit more stretch. So again, I'm going to go above 100. And as it collapses, this is where we can have it finish, if we like, back at 100. So I've just dragged that keyframe back in, and let's see how this is looking. Okay, so that's looking good. Now what we can do at this point is easy ease these keyframes, and I'll show you what this will do. So we just right click, select all the keyframes, right click and easy ease. And what this does is just helps to even out some of the movement. However, I'm not a fan of how it's slowing down here. I want that to keep consistent, so I'm going to just easy ease these last few keyframes. And let's see how this is looking. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Happier. Now what we can do at this point is turn on the motion blur for this layer and just make sure motion blur is selected for After Effects as well, and as it falls there will be a slight bit of motion blur now, which just adds an extra depth to the animation. So now what we want to do is have stretch interact with squash. So I'm going to drop down the options for stretch and just hit S on the keyboard to bring up scale. And what I want to do is tell After Effects at this point, the lowest point, I want the stretch to be affected. So at this point I want the scale, and don't forget to turn off the link button here. I want the scale to have pushed it to about here. So now we should be able to see. Now we don't want this to happen because we don't want stretch to anticipate squash hitting it. So I'm going to now bring this keyframe very close to this keyframe. So it's almost just 1 frame difference. So at this point they both react. Okay, and then as squash jumps above it to about here, we can have scale go back to 100. So we should see these 3 things moving together. And if we want, we can move this to here as well. Now these do move quite close to each other, so we could add another bounce effect, but I'm just going to see how this looks. Okay, I'm quite happy with that, and I'm just going to select these keyframes once more. and right click, and I'm going to easy ease, just to easy ease the effect a bit more. Okay, now at this point it's looking quite slow, and we can speed everything up by moving it all together. So I'm just going to grab all the keyframes, so select all of the keyframes like this, and I'm going to hold Alt, grab this last keyframe and drag them all in like so. And this is, by doing this, selecting all of them and dragging, what you're doing is you're telling After Effects to move them all in sync, so you're not losing any settings and you don't have to move each keyframe individually and match them all back up. So it's getting a bit quicker, and we could get it even closer like so and see how this is looking. So just be aware that if you adjust it too much, it's going to make the movement very quick. And at this point I could alter this. I'm not too happy with the bounce, so I could adjust some of the bounce just so it's a little bit more consistent and not so speeded up at the end. But I'm going to leave it here and let you guys have a play with the same effect at your end. Thank you very much.